What makes this moment so important is that most people never realize their belief system is failing until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. By then, the stress is already accumulated, the confusion has already taken root, and the gap between expectation and reality has become painfully clear. I have found that beliefs operate much like invisible software running in the background of our lives. We rarely stop to examine the code. We simply trust that it is working. We assume that because a belief has been with us for years, it must still be serving us today. But life has a way of testing every assumption. A belief that helped us survive one chapter of life may limit us in the next. A belief that once created stability can eventually create resistance. The challenge is that we often identify so strongly with our beliefs that questioning them feels like questioning ourselves. This is where a deeper understanding of human consciousness becomes essential. Consciousness is not fixed. It is dynamic. It evolves through experience, observation, and awareness. Every new experience offers information. Every challenge presents feedback. Every unexpected outcome provides data that can either strengthen an existing belief or reveal its limitations. The problem is that many of us have been conditioned to defend our beliefs rather than investigate them. Think about how often we encounter information that contradicts our expectations. In many cases, the immediate response is not curiosity, it is protection. The mind rushes to preserve what feels familiar because familiarity creates a sense of safety. Yet growth often begins where certainty ends. Ancient traditions understood something fascinating about this process. They taught that wisdom emerges through observation of oneself. Rather than reacting automatically to every thought, emotion, or circumstance, individuals were encouraged to become witnesses to their own internal patterns. Modern neuroscience is revealing a remarkably similar insight. Researchers have discovered that the brain is constantly adapting in response to experience. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. Thoughts that are practiced become easier to access. Emotional responses that are repeated become familiar patterns. In other words, our beliefs are not merely abstract ideas. They become biological expressions. When we repeatedly expect disappointment, the body begins preparing for disappointment. When we constantly anticipate conflict, stress chemistry may become a normal part of daily life. When we believe we are powerless, our perception often filters reality in ways that reinforce that conclusion. This does not mean beliefs magically create every outcome. What it does mean is that beliefs influence the lens through which we interpret experience. That lens affects our decisions, our behaviors, our emotional responses, and ultimately the opportunities we notice or ignore. I find it useful to imagine an internal file folder stored within consciousness. Inside this folder are thousands of assumptions collected throughout life. Some came from childhood experiences, others emerged from cultural influences, education, relationships, successes, and disappointments. Many of these files have never been reviewed. They simply remain active because they were installed long ago. The question becomes, what happens when outdated files continue directing present-day choices? Imagine using a map created decades ago to navigate a modern city. Roads have changed, new pathways exist, old routes no longer function. Yet if we refuse to update the map, frustration becomes inevitable. The same principle applies to belief systems. Some beliefs continue serving us beautifully. They encourage resilience, creativity, compassion, and adaptability. Others quietly generate limitations that no longer reflect reality. One of the most powerful exercises I have encountered involves asking a simple question whenever strong emotional reactions arise. What belief is being challenged right now? That question shifts attention away from external circumstances and toward the internal framework interpreting those circumstances. For example, rejection may trigger pain not simply because of the event itself, but because it activates a deeper belief about worthiness. Failure may feel devastating because it touches an underlying belief about identity. Uncertainty may generate anxiety because it challenges a belief that control is necessary for safety. The event becomes a doorway. The emotion becomes a messenger. And the belief hidden beneath the emotion becomes the real subject of investigation. This perspective transforms difficulties into opportunities for discovery. Instead of asking why life is happening against us, we begin exploring what life may be revealing within us. Interestingly, studies examining the relationship between emotional states and physical health continue uncovering meaningful connections between mind and body. Emotional patterns influence physiological processes. Chronic stress affects biological systems. Positive emotional experiences support different internal conditions. The body is listening far more closely than many people realize. Every thought generates activity. Every emotion carries information. Every belief contributes to a larger conversation occurring within the nervous system. This is why updating our internal file folder matters so much. The goal is not to abandon every belief. The goal is to identify which beliefs align with present reality and which ones belong to a version of ourselves that no longer exists. Awareness becomes the organizing principle. The moment we become conscious of a belief, we create distance between ourselves and that belief. We no longer have to operate automatically. We gain the freedom to evaluate, question, and refine. That freedom may be one of the most underestimated capacities of human consciousness. Many people spend years trying to change circumstances without examining the beliefs generating their responses to those circumstances. Yet, when the internal framework shifts, perception changes. When perception changes, choices change. When choices change, entire trajectories can begin moving in unexpected directions. This does not happen overnight. It unfolds through observation, honesty, and willingness to explore unfamiliar territory. And perhaps that is why the internal file folder is so important. Hidden within its contents are not only the beliefs that limit us, but also the beliefs that have quietly shaped every major decision, every emotional reaction, and every expectation we carry into the future. The real discovery begins the moment we open that folder and notice one particular file that has been running silently for years without ever being questioned. The moment that file comes into awareness, something remarkable happens. What was once invisible becomes visible. What was once automatic becomes a conscious choice. And that single shift can alter the direction of an entire life. I have often noticed that the most influential beliefs are rarely the loudest ones. They do not constantly announce themselves. Instead, they operate quietly beneath the surface, shaping perception from the shadows. A person may sincerely believe they are open to opportunity, yet carry an unconscious assumption that success always comes with sacrifice. Another may desire meaningful relationships while holding a hidden belief that vulnerability leads to disappointment. These contradictions create internal tension that is often difficult to recognize. From the outside, the struggle appears mysterious. From the inside, it is often the result of competing programs running simultaneously. This is why self-awareness is such a powerful force. Awareness allows us to detect these conflicting instructions before they determine our behavior. Consider what happens when a belief is challenged by new evidence. The conscious mind may recognize the new information immediately, yet deeper patterns can remain attached to older conclusions. This creates a fascinating experience many people encounter during periods of personal growth. Part of them wants to move forward. Another part keeps pulling backward. The resulting tension can feel exhausting. But rather than viewing that tension as failure, I see it as evidence that transformation is already underway. When old assumptions begin losing their grip, uncertainty naturally appears. The mind temporarily stands between two realities, the familiar reality it has always known, and the emerging reality it is learning to trust. This transitional space is where many people turn back, not because growth is impossible, because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. The human nervous system often prefers predictable discomfort over unpredictable possibility. At least familiar limitations are known territory. Yet every meaningful breakthrough requires crossing that threshold. Ancient observers of human nature understood this principle well. They recognized that personal transformation involves more than acquiring information. It involves releasing attachment to outdated interpretations of reality. Knowledge alone is not enough. Information can fill the mind while leaving behavior unchanged. Real change occurs when understanding reaches deeper layers of consciousness. This is where emotions play an essential role. Many people think emotions interfere with rational thinking, yet emotions are also valuable indicators. They reveal where energy is concentrated. They expose areas where beliefs are deeply rooted. If a simple conversation triggers a strong reaction, it may be worth asking why. If a minor setback feels overwhelming, it may be useful to explore what meaning has been assigned to that experience. The intensity of an emotional response often points toward a belief that deserves examination. I am not suggesting that every emotion is inaccurate. Far from it. Emotions provide important feedback about our inner world. The challenge is learning how to listen without immediately becoming consumed by what we hear. Imagine standing beside a river. You observe the water flowing past. You do not attempt to stop every current. You simply notice it. The same approach can be applied to thoughts and emotions. Rather than identifying completely with every mental narrative, we can learn to observe the patterns moving through awareness. This creates a powerful distinction. We are not every thought we think. We are not every emotion we experience. We are the awareness capable of observing both. That realization alone can transform the way we relate to challenges. Instead of becoming trapped inside fear, we can observe fear. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by doubt, we can examine doubt. Instead of automatically accepting every belief as truth, we can investigate whether it still reflects reality. Modern research into neuroplasticity offers fascinating support for this perspective. The brain remains adaptable throughout life. New experiences create new connections. Repeated attention strengthens new pathways. In practical terms, this means change is not limited to youth. The capacity for learning, adaptation, and growth remains available far longer than many people assume. Yet adaptation requires participation. The brain changes in response to experience, practice, and focus. If we repeatedly revisit the same fears, the same worries, and the same limitations, those pathways become increasingly familiar. If we repeatedly cultivate curiosity, resilience, and possibility, different pathways begin strengthening. What we consistently practice becomes easier to access. This principle extends beyond thought patterns into physical biology. The body responds continuously to internal states. A mind filled with constant threat perception sends different signals through the nervous system than a mind grounded in safety and confidence. Over time, these signals influence countless processes occurring beneath conscious awareness. This does not mean we can simply think our way out of every challenge. Life remains complex. Unexpected events still occur. Difficult circumstances still arise. However, our relationship with those circumstances can change dramatically. And that relationship often begins with belief. One belief says challenges are evidence of personal inadequacy. Another belief says challenges are opportunities for learning. The external event may be identical. The internal interpretation creates entirely different experiences. This understanding reveals something profound about human consciousness. Reality is not experienced directly. Reality is experienced through interpretation. Every moment passes through filters created by memory, expectation, belief, and emotion. Most of the time, we are unaware these filters exist. We assume we are seeing reality exactly as it is. Yet two individuals can encounter the same situation and emerge with completely different conclusions. Their interpretations differ because their internal file folders contain different instructions. The implications of this realization are enormous. If beliefs shape interpretation, then updating beliefs can expand perception. Opportunities that once seemed invisible become noticeable. Possibilities that once appeared unrealistic become attainable. Solutions that once seemed hidden come into view. The world itself may not have changed, but the lens through which we observe it has evolved. This is why I believe one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves is not, what do I think? But rather, why do I think it? That question leads deeper. It bypasses surface opinions and explores their origins. Where did this belief begin? What experience created it? Has it been tested recently? Does it still serve growth, health, and understanding? Or is it simply familiar? The answers to these questions often reveal surprising insights, and occasionally they uncover something even more significant. They reveal that the belief we once considered an absolute truth was actually a temporary conclusion formed under very different circumstances. The moment we recognize that possibility, another file inside the folder begins to attract our attention. Not the file containing our fears, not the file containing our limitations, but the one containing a forgotten possibility about who we might become if those limitations were no longer defining the boundaries of our world. When that forgotten possibility begins to emerge, the experience can feel both exciting and unsettling at the same time. Exciting because we sense new potential. Unsettling because every expansion of awareness requires us to leave something familiar behind. I have noticed that many people spend years searching for answers outside themselves while overlooking a deeper source of guidance already present within their own experience. They gather information, study countless perspectives, and accumulate knowledge, yet still feel disconnected from the clarity they seek. The reason is often simple. Information can inform us, but awareness transforms us. Awareness changes the way we relate to information. It changes the way we interpret events. It changes the way we understand ourselves. The forgotten possibility hidden inside that file folder is not merely a new belief. It is a new relationship with belief itself. Instead of treating beliefs as permanent truths, we begin seeing them as working models of reality, useful when accurate, adaptable when necessary. This shift creates tremendous freedom. Suddenly, growth is no longer threatening because identity is no longer attached to being right all the time. Curiosity becomes more important than certainty. Exploration becomes more valuable than rigid conclusions. And this is where human consciousness reveals one of its most extraordinary qualities. We possess the ability to observe our own thinking. Few capacities are as remarkable as this. We can step outside a pattern and examine it. We can notice assumptions while they are operating. We can witness thoughts arising without immediately obeying them. This ability creates space. And in that space, choice becomes possible. Without awareness, reactions appear automatic. Circumstances seem to control us. External events dictate emotional responses. With awareness, a different experience emerges. We begin recognizing that between stimulus and response, there exists a moment of possibility. Sometimes that moment is brief. Sometimes it lasts only seconds. Yet within those seconds lies tremendous power. A person who automatically reacts with anger may learn to pause. A person who immediately assumes failure may learn to question that assumption. A person who expects rejection may begin noticing evidence that challenges the expectation. These may appear to be small shifts, but their cumulative effect can be enormous. Entire lives are often shaped by tiny decisions repeated consistently over time. One thought leads to another. One belief influences another. One perception creates a choice. One choice creates an experience. And that experience often reinforces the belief that initiated the cycle. This feedback loop operates continuously. The encouraging news is that awareness allows us to interrupt the cycle. The moment we recognize a pattern, we are no longer completely controlled by it. Imagine discovering that a navigation system has been directing you toward the wrong destination for years. The discovery might be frustrating, but it is also liberating. Once you know the route is incorrect, you can choose a different direction. The same principle applies to limiting beliefs. Recognition is not failure. Recognition is progress. In fact, some of the most important breakthroughs begin with discomfort. The discomfort comes from seeing something we previously ignored. The breakthrough comes from refusing to look away. I have observed that people often underestimate the courage required for genuine self-examination. It is easy to analyze external circumstances. It is far more challenging to investigate the assumptions shaping our perception of those circumstances. Yet this investigation is where profound transformation begins, because hidden beneath many limiting beliefs lies a simple misunderstanding. A temporary experience becomes a permanent conclusion. A single disappointment becomes an expectation. A moment of fear becomes an identity. An isolated event becomes a lifelong prediction. The mind naturally seeks patterns. It attempts to create certainty from experience. This tendency can be helpful. It allows us to learn, adapt, and navigate complex environments. However, it can also lead us to carry conclusions far beyond their usefulness. A child who experiences criticism may conclude that mistakes are dangerous. A person who encounters betrayal may conclude that trust is risky. Someone who faces repeated setbacks may conclude that effort is pointless. These conclusions often feel true because they were formed during emotionally significant moments. But emotional intensity does not automatically guarantee accuracy. This distinction is crucial. A belief may feel absolutely real while still being incomplete. And when consciousness expands, incomplete stories begin revealing themselves. This does not happen through force. It happens through observation. The goal is not to wage war against old beliefs. The goal is to understand them. When we understand why a belief exists, we gain insight into the role it once played. Many limiting beliefs originally developed as forms of protection. They attempted to prevent future pain. They attempted to create safety. They attempted to reduce uncertainty. The problem is that protection can eventually become restriction. What once helped us survive may later prevent us from thriving. At some point, every belief must answer an important question. Are you helping me grow, or are you helping me stay the same? That question has the power to reveal hidden truths. Growth often requires uncertainty. Growth often involves risk. Growth frequently demands that we step beyond familiar boundaries. A belief system designed only to maintain comfort may resist all three. Yet life itself is constantly evolving. Nature evolves. Knowledge evolves. Understanding evolves. Human consciousness evolves. Everything around us demonstrates movement, adaptation, and transformation. Why would our internal world be any different? Perhaps the purpose of awareness is not to create a fixed identity. Perhaps its purpose is to help us remain open to continuous discovery. If that is true, then the file folder we have been exploring contains far more than memories and assumptions. It contains evidence of an ongoing journey. Each belief tells a story about who we thought we were. Each experience contributes to who we are becoming. And somewhere between those two realities exists a powerful opportunity, the opportunity to consciously participate in our own evolution, not by pretending challenges do not exist, not by ignoring difficult emotions, but by recognizing that every challenge, every emotion, and every belief carries information. The question is whether we are willing to listen closely enough to hear what that information is trying to reveal. Because the next file waiting to be opened is not about the past at all. It is about the future version of ourselves that has been quietly waiting for permission to emerge. The future version of ourselves does not arrive suddenly. It is not created in a single breakthrough moment, nor is it revealed through one life-changing insight. Instead, it emerges gradually through hundreds of small decisions that most people barely notice. I believe this is one of the greatest misunderstandings about transformation. Many expect change to feel dramatic. In reality, lasting change is often subtle. It begins the moment we choose a different interpretation of an old experience. It begins when we respond differently to a familiar challenge. It begins when awareness interrupts a pattern that has operated automatically for years. At first, these shifts seem insignificant. Yet consciousness pays attention to repetition. What we repeatedly think, feel, and practice gradually becomes part of our internal reality. This is why the future version of ourselves is not waiting somewhere ahead of us. In many ways, it already exists as potential within us now. The question is whether our current beliefs allow that potential to express itself. Imagine carrying a seed in your hand. The seed contains the blueprint for something much larger than its present form. Yet the growth remains invisible until conditions support its development. Human potential works in a similar way. Capabilities often exist before evidence appears. Possibilities often exist before results become visible. Growth frequently begins beneath the surface long before anyone can see it. This understanding can be especially important during periods when progress feels slow. There are moments in life when external circumstances show little sign of change. The old challenges remain. The same responsibilities continue. The same uncertainties appear each morning. From the outside, it may seem as though nothing is happening. Yet internally, Significant shifts may already be underway. A new level of awareness may be developing. A deeper understanding may be taking shape. An outdated belief may be losing influence. And these invisible changes often become the foundation for visible transformations later. Nature offers countless examples of this principle. Before a tree appears above the ground, important development occurs beneath the surface. Roots expand, structures form, stability is established. The visible growth arrives later. Human development often follows a similar pattern. The most meaningful changes frequently begin where nobody can see them. They begin in perception. They begin in understanding. They begin in consciousness. This is why patience becomes such a valuable skill. Not passive patience, conscious patience. The kind that recognizes growth as a process rather than an event. The kind that understands transformation is occurring even when immediate results are absent. Many people abandon positive changes because they expect instant evidence. When evidence does not appear quickly, they assume nothing is working. Yet some of the most important developments require time. A belief formed over decades rarely dissolves overnight. A deeply conditioned emotional pattern may require consistent awareness before it begins to change. An identity built around limitation may resist expansion at first. This resistance is natural. The familiar mind seeks familiarity. Even when familiar patterns create frustration, they provide predictability. The unknown, by contrast, introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty often activates fear. I find it fascinating that fear itself is frequently misunderstood. Many assume fear is proof that something is wrong, but often fear is simply evidence that we have reached the edge of what feels familiar. The feeling itself does not necessarily indicate danger. Sometimes it indicates growth. Sometimes it indicates possibility. Sometimes it indicates that an old belief system is being challenged by a larger perspective. This distinction can change everything. Instead of viewing fear as a signal to retreat, we can begin viewing it as information. What belief is being challenged? What assumption is being questioned? What possibility is attempting to emerge? These questions redirect attention from the emotion itself to the deeper process unfolding beneath it. And that deeper process often reveals something unexpected. Many limitations are sustained not by reality, but by anticipation. We imagine outcomes before they occur. We predict disappointment before evidence exists. We assume failure before action begins. The body responds to these predictions as though they are already happening. Stress increases, confidence decreases, possibility narrows, all because of a future that exists only in imagination. This does not mean challenges are imaginary. Challenges are real. Consequences are real. Difficult circumstances are real. But many of the barriers we experience are amplified by stories we tell ourselves about what those circumstances mean. When consciousness becomes aware of these stories, new options become available. We can revise the narrative. We can question the interpretation. We can examine whether the conclusion is supported by present reality or merely inherited from past experience. This ability may be one of the greatest strengths of the human mind. We are not permanently bound to old narratives. We can learn. We can adapt. We can evolve. The future version of ourselves depends upon this capacity, because every stage of growth eventually requires the release of a previous identity. The person who develops confidence cannot remain fully attached to the identity of self-doubt. The person who embraces possibility cannot remain completely committed to limitation. The person who expands awareness cannot continue viewing reality through the same narrow lens forever. Something must change, not because we reject who we were, but because growth invites us to become more than we were. I often think of consciousness as an ever-expanding horizon. Each time we reach what seems like the edge of understanding, a wider view becomes available. New questions emerge. New insights appear. New possibilities reveal themselves. The journey continues. And perhaps this is why no belief system should ever become a prison. Beliefs are meant to support exploration, not prevent it. They are meant to guide discovery, not replace it. The moment a belief convinces us that growth is complete, curiosity begins to fade. Yet curiosity may be one of the most powerful forces available to human consciousness. Curiosity keeps awareness alive. Curiosity keeps learning active. Curiosity keeps the future open. And as we continue exploring the contents of that internal file folder, another realization begins to emerge, one that challenges an assumption so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the way most people understand themselves, that once it becomes visible, it changes the meaning of every belief that came before it. That realization begins with a simple observation. Most people spend their lives asking what they should believe, while rarely asking who is doing the believing. At first, this distinction may seem subtle, but the more I reflect on it, the more significant it becomes. Every belief exists within awareness. Every thought appears within awareness. Every emotion is experienced within awareness. Yet awareness itself is often overlooked. We become so focused on the content of our experience that we forget to examine the space in which that experience occurs. Imagine sitting in a theater. Most of the audience becomes completely absorbed in the movie on the screen. They laugh, worry, anticipate, and react to every scene. Their attention remains fixed on the story unfolding before them. But occasionally someone remembers that they are sitting in a theater, the screen is still there, the story continues, yet their relationship to the experience changes. They are no longer completely lost in the narrative. Something similar can happen within consciousness. We spend years identifying with every thought that passes through the mind. We assume each thought reflects reality. We assume each emotional reaction defines who we are. We assume every belief represents an unchanging truth. Then awareness deepens, and suddenly we begin noticing the observer behind the experience. This shift does not eliminate thoughts. It does not erase emotions. It does not make challenges disappear. Instead, it creates perspective, and perspective changes everything. When awareness recognizes itself, beliefs lose some of their power to control perception automatically. A thought can be observed rather than obeyed. An emotion can be felt without becoming an identity. A belief can be examined without being defended. This level of consciousness creates remarkable flexibility. The mind becomes less rigid. The nervous system becomes less reactive. Possibilities expand. I have noticed that some of the most transformative moments in life occur when a person realizes they are larger than the stories they have been telling themselves. For years, they may have repeated the same narrative. Perhaps they believed they were always unlucky. Perhaps they believed they lacked talent. Perhaps they believed they were destined to repeat old patterns. The story felt real because it had been repeated so many times. Yet, repetition does not automatically create truth. It creates familiarity. And familiarity can be mistaken for reality. The difference matters. Because if a story is merely familiar, it can be revised. If a narrative is learned, it can be unlearned. If a belief was created, it can be recreated. This understanding opens the door to a deeper question. What if many of the limitations we consider permanent are actually maintained through continuous reinforcement? What if they persist not because they are fixed realities, but because they are repeatedly practiced interpretations? Modern studies of learning and adaptation suggest that repetition plays a profound role in shaping neural pathways. What receives attention grows stronger. What is practiced becomes easier. What is reinforced becomes familiar. This principle applies not only to skills, but also to perception. The mind becomes efficient at finding evidence that supports existing expectations. If we expect rejection, we become highly sensitive to signs of rejection. If we expect opportunity, we begin noticing opportunities that were previously ignored. Neither perspective guarantees outcomes, but each influences what enters conscious awareness. This means that beliefs do more than shape conclusions. They shape observation itself. They influence what we notice. They influence what we overlook. They influence how we interpret information before conscious analysis even begins. That realization can feel startling because it suggests that our experience of reality is far more interactive than many people realize. We are not merely observing the world. We are constantly participating in the way we perceive it. And this participation occurs whether we are aware of it or not. The advantage of awareness is that it brings this process into view. Once seen, it can be refined. Once understood, it can be directed more consciously. This is where responsibility enters the conversation. Not blame, responsibility. There is an important difference. Blame looks backward and assigns fault. Responsibility looks forward and recognizes influence. When we become aware of how beliefs shape perception, we gain influence over future choices. We may not control every circumstance. We may not determine every outcome, but we can become more conscious of the internal framework through which those experiences are interpreted. That framework matters enormously. Two people can face identical obstacles and emerge with completely different understandings of what occurred. One concludes that the obstacle proves their limitations. The other concludes that the obstacle revealed their strength. The external event remains the same. The meaning changes, and meaning often determines the direction of future action. I find this particularly fascinating because it reveals how consciousness and experience continually interact. Beliefs influence perception. Perception influences action. Action influences results. Results influence beliefs. The cycle repeats. Most people remain inside this cycle without recognizing it. Awareness allows us to step outside long enough to observe its operation. Once we see the pattern, new possibilities emerge. We can choose different interpretations. We can ask different questions. We can explore perspectives that were previously unavailable. And sometimes, one new perspective is enough to change the trajectory of an entire life. Not because circumstances instantly transform, but because consciousness begins relating to those circumstances differently. The future starts to look less like a continuation of the past and more like an open field of possibility. This is why examining our internal file folder remains such an important practice. Each belief represents more than an idea. It represents a lens, a filter, a framework, a way of organizing experience. Some of those frameworks support growth. Others quietly restrict it. The challenge is identifying which is which, and that process requires honesty. Not the kind of honesty directed toward other people, the kind directed inward, the willingness to ask difficult questions, the willingness to reconsider familiar conclusions, the willingness to explore what might exist beyond the boundaries of long-held assumptions. Because eventually, as awareness continues expanding, we encounter a discovery that feels both liberating and unsettling at the same time. We begin to realize that the beliefs we thought were protecting our identity may have been limiting it. And beyond those limitations waits an entirely different understanding of what human potential might actually be. When that possibility first appears, it rarely arrives with certainty. More often, it arrives as a question, a quiet question, a persistent question, a question that refuses to disappear. What if I am capable of more than I have allowed myself to believe? For many people, that question becomes a turning point. Not because it immediately changes their circumstances, but because it changes the direction of their attention. Instead of searching for evidence that confirms limitation, they begin looking for evidence that supports growth. Instead of asking why something cannot happen, they begin asking what might become possible if they approach the situation differently. This shift may sound simple, yet its implications are profound. Attention is one of the most valuable resources available to human consciousness. Whatever consistently receives attention tends to grow in significance. Whatever is repeatedly ignored tends to fade from awareness. This means that the quality of our attention helps shape the quality of our experience. I have often reflected on how many opportunities pass unnoticed each day. Not because they are absent, because they fall outside our expectations. The mind is constantly filtering information. Every second, countless details compete for awareness. The brain must decide what deserves attention and what can be ignored. Beliefs help make those decisions. They act like instructions guiding perception. If a belief tells us that possibilities are limited, the mind becomes skilled at finding limitations. If a belief suggests that learning is always available, the mind becomes more sensitive to opportunities for growth. The environment may remain unchanged. The experience of the environment changes dramatically. This helps explain why two individuals can stand in the same situation and perceive entirely different realities. One sees obstacles, another sees lessons, one sees uncertainty, another sees potential, one sees an ending, another sees a beginning. Neither perspective necessarily captures the whole picture, yet each perspective influences behavior, and behavior influences outcomes. This relationship between perception and action reveals something fascinating about personal transformation. Most people attempt to change results directly. They focus exclusively on external circumstances. While circumstances certainly matter, they are often the final expression of deeper internal patterns. A gardener does not change a harvest by painting the leaves. The gardener changes the conditions that influence growth. In a similar way, lasting transformation often begins beneath the surface. It begins with assumptions. It begins with interpretation. It begins with awareness. The future version of ourselves emerges through these deeper shifts, long before visible evidence appears. This can be challenging because modern culture often celebrates immediate results. We are encouraged to measure progress by visible outcomes. Yet, some of the most important forms of growth are initially invisible. Greater self-awareness is invisible. Increased emotional resilience is invisible. Expanded perspective is invisible. A more refined understanding of ourselves is invisible. And yet these developments frequently become the foundation upon which future achievements are built. I sometimes think of consciousness as a vast landscape that most people explore only partially. We become familiar with a few regions. We establish routines. We create explanations. We develop predictable ways of thinking. Then we assume the territory we have explored represents the entire map. But awareness has a way of revealing unexplored regions. New perspectives emerge. Old certainties become less rigid. Questions appear where assumptions once existed. This process can feel uncomfortable because certainty often creates psychological comfort. The unknown does not. Yet nearly every major discovery in human history required someone to venture beyond accepted conclusions. The same principle applies internally. Personal breakthroughs frequently occur when we become willing to investigate assumptions that previously seemed unquestionable. What if failure is not evidence of inadequacy? What if uncertainty is not evidence of danger? What if change is not something to fear, but something to understand? Questions like these create openings. They loosen the grip of rigid thinking. They allow consciousness to move beyond familiar boundaries. And once those boundaries begin expanding, an interesting phenomenon often occurs. We start noticing connections that were previously invisible. Experiences that once seemed unrelated begin revealing patterns. Challenges that once appeared meaningless begin offering insight. Events that felt random begin contributing to a larger understanding of ourselves. This does not mean every experience happens for a specific reason. Rather, it means that awareness can extract meaning from experience in ways that support growth. Meaning is powerful. Meaning influences motivation. Meaning influences resilience. Meaning influences how long we persist when circumstances become difficult. A person who believes a challenge has meaning often responds differently than someone who sees only frustration. The challenge itself may remain unchanged. The interpretation transforms the experience. This is why beliefs deserve careful examination, not because every belief is wrong, because every belief influences perception. and perception influences the way we move through life. The internal file folder we have been exploring contains countless assumptions about possibility, capability, success, failure, connection, and identity. Some of those assumptions are accurate, some are outdated, some are incomplete. The purpose of awareness is not to destroy the folder. The purpose is to organize it consciously, to determine which files deserve continued attention and which files no longer reflect reality. This process requires courage, not dramatic courage, quiet courage. The courage to question familiar conclusions. The courage to release narratives that no longer serve growth. The courage to remain open when certainty feels more comfortable. I believe this kind of courage becomes increasingly important as consciousness evolves, because every expansion of awareness eventually presents a choice. We can return to what is familiar, or we can continue exploring. We can defend old assumptions, or we can investigate new possibilities. We can define ourselves by past experiences, or we can allow those experiences to inform us without imprisoning us. And perhaps that is where the next discovery begins. Not in changing the world around us first, but in recognizing that the boundaries we perceive may not be fixed boundaries at all. They may simply be the edges of a belief system that has not yet caught up with the full potential of the consciousness observing it. And once that possibility becomes visible, an even deeper question starts to emerge from somewhere beyond the familiar patterns of thought. A question that challenges not only what we believe about ourselves, but what we believe human consciousness is truly capable of becoming. That deeper question invites us into territory that many people rarely explore. What if consciousness is not merely reacting to life, but actively participating in the way life is experienced? The more I examine human behavior, the more I notice that our inner world and outer world are engaged in a continuous dialogue. Thoughts influence emotions, emotions influence perception, perception influences decisions, decisions influence experiences. Experiences then feed new information back into the system. The cycle never truly stops. It is constantly evolving. Yet, because this process operates continuously, we often overlook its significance. We assume that our current understanding of ourselves is complete. We assume that our present limitations accurately define our future possibilities. We assume that because something has always been difficult, it must remain difficult. But assumptions are not always reliable guides. Some assumptions reveal truth. Others simply reveal habit. This distinction becomes increasingly important as awareness expands, because one of the most powerful discoveries a person can make is that habit and truth are not the same thing. A familiar thought can feel true simply because it has been repeated thousands of times. A familiar emotional response can feel permanent simply because it has occurred for years. A familiar belief can feel unquestionable simply because it has never been challenged. Yet repetition alone does not determine reality. It determines familiarity. And familiarity often creates the illusion of certainty. I find it fascinating how quickly the mind turns repeated experiences into identity. Someone experiences a setback and begins believing they are unsuccessful. Someone struggles socially and begins believing they are unworthy of connection. Someone encounters uncertainty and begins believing they are incapable of handling change. Over time, these interpretations become deeply woven into self-perception. Eventually, they stop feeling like beliefs. They feel like facts. That is why awareness is so valuable. Awareness allows us to separate observation from interpretation. For example, failing at a task is an observation. Concluding that we are a failure is an interpretation. Experiencing fear is an observation. Concluding that we are weak is an interpretation. Encountering difficulty is an observation. Concluding that growth is impossible is an interpretation. When we recognize this difference, an entirely new level of freedom becomes available, because interpretations can be revised. Interpretations can evolve. Interpretations can become more accurate. This does not mean adopting unrealistic optimism. It means developing greater clarity. It means seeing situations as they are, rather than through the lens of outdated assumptions. And clarity often reveals possibilities that fear conceals. I have observed that many people underestimate the role imagination plays in shaping experience. When most people hear the word imagination, they think of fantasy. But imagination is also responsible for anticipation. It creates mental pictures of future outcomes. It rehearses possibilities before they occur. It generates expectations that influence emotional and physiological responses. Every worry involves imagination. Every hope involves imagination. Every prediction involves imagination. The question is not whether imagination is influencing us. The question is how it is influencing us. A mind that constantly imagines failure creates a very different internal environment than a mind that remains open to possibility. Again, this does not guarantee specific outcomes. Life remains unpredictable. But the internal conditions from which decisions emerge matter greatly. Imagine two people standing before the same opportunity. One imagines embarrassment, rejection, and disappointment. The other imagines learning, growth, and discovery. Who is more likely to take action? Who is more likely to persist through challenges? Who is more likely to recognize unexpected opportunities? The answer becomes obvious. The images we carry within consciousness influence the choices we make in the external world. This understanding brings us back to the internal file folder, because hidden among old beliefs are countless images of what we think is possible. Some images empower us. Others constrain us. Some encourage exploration. Others encourage avoidance. Many of these internal pictures were formed years ago. Some were created during moments of success. Others emerged during periods of uncertainty or disappointment. Yet despite their age, they continue influencing present behavior unless awareness intervenes. Unless we consciously review what has been stored. The process of reviewing these files can be illuminating. We begin discovering that some beliefs were inherited rather than chosen. Some assumptions were accepted without examination. Some conclusions were formed before we possessed the maturity or perspective necessary to evaluate them accurately. This realization is not a criticism of the past. It is an acknowledgement of growth. The person we are today possesses insights that were unavailable years ago. Experience has expanded perspective. Awareness has deepened understanding. Consciousness has evolved. Why should our beliefs remain frozen while everything else continues changing? This question becomes especially important during major life transitions. Periods of change often expose the limitations of old frameworks. Strategies that once worked stop producing the same results. Explanations that once felt sufficient no longer satisfy. The mind begins searching for a larger understanding. At first, this can feel disorienting. The old map no longer explains the territory, yet the new map has not fully emerged. Many people interpret this uncertainty as a problem. I increasingly see it as an invitation to explore, an invitation to question, an invitation to discover aspects of ourselves that remained hidden beneath familiar assumptions. Because beyond every outdated belief lies the possibility of a more accurate understanding. And beyond every limitation that consciousness recognizes lies an opportunity for expansion. Not expansion in the sense of becoming someone else. Expansion in the sense of becoming more fully ourselves. More aware, more present, more capable of responding consciously rather than automatically. The future version of ourselves is not waiting to be created from nothing. It is waiting to be uncovered, layer by layer, belief by belief, insight by insight. And as those layers continue falling away, another realization begins taking shape, one so subtle that many people miss it entirely, yet so transformative that once it is seen, the relationship between consciousness, possibility, and human potential can never be viewed in quite the same way again. That realization begins to emerge when we notice something extraordinary about the way consciousness operates. The mind is constantly searching for answers. It wants certainty. It wants conclusions. It wants a clear explanation for every experience. Yet some of the most important discoveries in life do not arrive as answers. They arrive as a greater capacity to remain present with questions. This may sound paradoxical at first. After all, most people assume wisdom means possessing more answers. But the deeper I explore the nature of awareness, the more I see that wisdom often involves developing a healthier relationship with uncertainty. Not because uncertainty is comfortable, because uncertainty is where possibility lives. The moment we become absolutely certain about who we are, what we can do, and what is possible, growth begins to slow. The mind closes around a fixed identity. The future becomes confined to familiar expectations. Potential becomes limited by conclusions formed in the past. Yet life continually demonstrates that reality is far more dynamic than our assumptions. People discover strengths they never knew they possessed. Capabilities emerge under unexpected circumstances. New opportunities appear where none seem to exist. Entire directions change because of a single insight, conversation, decision, or experience. What makes these moments so fascinating is that they often become visible only after they occur. Looking backward, the path appears obvious. Looking forward, it was invisible. This tells us something important. The future cannot always be predicted through the lens of present beliefs. Sometimes our beliefs are simply too small for the possibilities that have not yet unfolded. This is why I believe openness is one of the most underrated qualities of consciousness. Openness does not mean accepting every idea without examination. It means remaining willing to discover that reality may be larger than our current understanding of it. That willingness changes how we approach life. Instead of defending every conclusion, we become explorers. Instead of protecting every assumption, we become investigators. Instead of clinging to certainty, we become students of experience. And students notice things others miss. They remain curious. They remain attentive. They remain available to new insights. Curiosity, in many ways, acts like a bridge between what we currently know and what we are capable of learning. Without curiosity, awareness contracts. With curiosity, awareness expands. This expansion affects more than intellectual understanding. It influences emotional flexibility as well. I have noticed that many emotional struggles become more manageable when approached with curiosity rather than judgment. Consider the difference. Judgment asks, why am I like this? Curiosity asks, what is this experience trying to teach me? Judgment often creates resistance. Curiosity creates exploration. Judgment narrows awareness. Curiosity broadens it. The emotional experience may remain the same initially, but our relationship with it changes. And relationships matter. The way we relate to thoughts, emotions, challenges, and beliefs often determines how much influence they have over us. A thought that is feared gains power. A thought that is observed gains context. An emotion that is resisted often intensifies. An emotion that is understood often reveals information. This principle applies to belief systems as well. When we cling to beliefs out of fear, they become rigid. When we examine beliefs with awareness, they become flexible. Flexibility is essential because life itself is flexible. Circumstances change. Knowledge evolves. Experiences accumulate. Understanding deepens. A healthy belief system must be capable of adapting alongside these changes. Otherwise, it eventually begins conflicting with reality. And when that conflict grows large enough, discomfort appears. Many people interpret that discomfort as evidence that something is wrong. But sometimes discomfort is evidence that consciousness is outgrowing an old framework. A child eventually outgrows certain clothes. A developing mind eventually outgrows certain explanations. An expanding awareness eventually outgrows certain beliefs. The discomfort does not necessarily indicate failure. It may indicate transition. This perspective can completely transform the way we interpret challenging periods of life. Instead of viewing them solely as problems to solve, we begin seeing them as signals to investigate. What is changing? What assumption is being challenged? What perspective is trying to emerge? Questions like these direct attention toward growth rather than resistance. And growth often reveals something surprising. Many of the boundaries we experience are maintained not by external conditions, but by internal definitions. We define ourselves according to past experiences. We define our capabilities according to previous outcomes. We define our future according to existing evidence. Then we forget that these definitions are interpretations rather than absolute realities. Awareness allows those definitions to be questioned, and once questioned, they begin losing their authority. This is where personal transformation becomes especially interesting, because transformation is not always about acquiring something new. Sometimes it is about removing something old. An outdated assumption, a limiting conclusion, a story that no longer reflects reality. As these layers fall away, clarity increases. And clarity has a remarkable effect on consciousness. It reduces internal conflict. It creates coherence between thought, emotion, and action. It allows energy previously spent defending limitations to be redirected toward exploration and growth. The result is often a greater sense of alignment, not because life becomes perfect, because perception becomes more accurate. We stop viewing ourselves exclusively through the lens of past experiences. We begin recognizing ourselves as dynamic beings capable of learning, adapting, and evolving. That recognition changes everything. Because once a person truly understands that identity is not fixed, potential expands dramatically. The future is no longer a repetition of the past. It becomes a field of possibilities shaped by awareness, intention, learning, and choice. And perhaps that is the hidden purpose of opening the internal file folder in the first place. Not merely to examine old beliefs, not merely to understand past patterns, but to discover that beneath every belief, beneath every story, and beneath every assumption about who we are, there exists an awareness far more expansive than the frameworks it once accepted. And that awareness is only beginning to reveal what it has been capable of all along. And when that awareness begins revealing its deeper capacities, something subtle but profound starts to change. The center of gravity shifts. Instead of living entirely from reaction, we begin living from observation. Instead of being carried by every emotional current, we learn to navigate those currents with greater understanding. Instead of allowing inherited assumptions to define the limits of our experience, we become active participants in shaping the meaning of that experience. This shift is not dramatic in the beginning. In fact, it is often so quiet that many people overlook it. Yet it may be one of the most significant transitions a human being can experience. Because for the first time, awareness starts recognizing itself as something more than the collection of thoughts, emotions, memories, and beliefs passing through it. A different perspective emerges. We begin noticing that thoughts come and go, emotions rise and fall, beliefs evolve, identities change. Yet something remains present throughout all of it. Something observes every stage. Something witnesses every transformation. The child becomes an adult. Circumstances change. Relationships evolve. Goals appear and disappear. Entire chapters of life come and go. Yet the capacity to be aware remains. This observation has fascinated philosophers, psychologists, and consciousness researchers for generations. Not because it provides a final answer, because it opens a doorway into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. Most people spend years trying to improve the content of their experience. They seek better circumstances, greater success, more security, more certainty. There is nothing wrong with these pursuits, but awareness introduces another possibility. What if the quality of our experience depends not only on what happens to us, but also on the state of consciousness through which those events are experienced? This question changes the conversation. Suddenly, growth is no longer limited to changing external conditions. Growth includes refining perception, developing awareness, cultivating emotional intelligence, expanding understanding. These qualities influence every experience regardless of circumstance. A person with greater awareness can encounter difficulty differently than someone operating entirely through unconscious patterns. The challenge may remain. The response changes, and responses matter. They determine whether experiences become sources of learning or sources of limitation. They influence whether setbacks create wisdom or reinforce fear. They shape whether uncertainty becomes an obstacle or an invitation. I have often noticed that people underestimate the cumulative power of small shifts in awareness. A single insight may seem insignificant. One moment of clarity may appear minor. One change in perspective may feel temporary. Yet these moments accumulate, they create momentum. And momentum eventually transforms identity. Consider how a river shapes stone. The change is not immediate. It occurs gradually through consistent influence. Day after day, year after year, the result appears dramatic only because the process was allowed to continue. Consciousness develops in a similar way. Small moments of awareness accumulate over time. Each observation weakens unconscious patterns. Each insight expands perspective. Each act of reflection deepens understanding. Eventually, the internal landscape begins looking very different than it once did. Old reactions lose their intensity. Old fears lose their authority. Old limitations lose their certainty, not because they were forcibly removed, because awareness gradually outgrew them. This process reveals something important about human potential. Potential is not always expressed through dramatic achievement. Sometimes it appears through greater presence, greater clarity, greater emotional balance, greater capacity to respond consciously to life. These qualities may not always receive public recognition, yet they profoundly influence the quality of human experience. A person who develops inner stability carries that stability into relationships. A person who develops awareness brings that awareness into decisions. A person who cultivates understanding contributes differently to every environment they enter. The effects extend far beyond the individual. This is one reason personal growth is never entirely personal. The way we think influences the way we communicate. The way we communicate influences the people around us. The way we interpret reality influences the choices we make and the examples we provide. Every internal shift creates external consequences, often in ways we never fully recognize. This understanding highlights the importance of examining the beliefs stored within our internal file folder, because beliefs do not remain isolated. They influence perception. Perception influences behavior. Behavior influences relationships. Relationships influence communities. The ripple effects continue outward. A single belief can affect far more than the individual who holds it. This realization adds a new dimension to the process of self-discovery. We are not merely updating beliefs for our own benefit. We are refining the lens through which we engage with life itself. And as that lens becomes clearer, another fascinating change occurs. The need to control everything begins to soften, not because uncertainty disappears, because awareness becomes more comfortable with uncertainty. The mind no longer requires immediate answers to every question. It no longer demands absolute guarantees before taking action. It becomes capable of moving forward while remaining open to learning. This flexibility is powerful. Rigid systems often break under pressure. Flexible systems adapt. Human consciousness possesses an extraordinary capacity for adaptation when it is not confined by outdated assumptions. The more awareness expands, the more obvious this becomes. Life continues changing. Challenges continue appearing. Unexpected events continue occurring, yet something within us becomes increasingly capable of meeting those experiences with clarity rather than automatic reaction. And perhaps this is where the deeper meaning of the file folder finally begins to reveal itself. Maybe the purpose was never simply to identify limiting beliefs. Maybe it was to uncover the awareness that exists beyond them. The awareness capable of observing, learning, adapting, and growing. The awareness that remains present through every chapter of life. The awareness that quietly waits beneath every story we tell ourselves. Because once that awareness becomes impossible to ignore, a final and even more transformative realization starts to emerge. One that challenges the assumption that human potential has a fixed ceiling and invites us to consider what becomes possible when consciousness is no longer defined by the limits it once believed were real. When consciousness is no longer confined by those perceived limits, the conversation about human potential changes completely. We stop asking how to become someone else. We begin asking how to remove the barriers preventing us from becoming more fully ourselves. That distinction matters. Much of modern life is built around the idea of adding something, more knowledge, more skills, more resources, more achievements, more recognition. While all of these can be valuable, awareness often reveals a different path. Sometimes growth is not about addition. Sometimes it is about subtraction, removing assumptions, removing unnecessary fear, removing outdated conclusions, removing stories that once served a purpose but no longer reflect reality. As these layers begin falling away, something remarkable becomes visible. Many of the qualities we seek externally may already exist internally in undeveloped form. Resilience may already be present. Creativity may already be present. Wisdom may already be present. Compassion may already be present. The challenge is not always creating these qualities. Often the challenge is creating conditions that allow them to emerge. This idea appears repeatedly across many fields of study. A seed does not need to be taught how to become what it was designed to become. It requires the right conditions. Growth unfolds naturally when obstacles are removed and supportive conditions exist. Human development often follows a similar principle. The qualities we admire in others are frequently potentials that exist within ourselves as well. Yet potentials require expression, and expression requires awareness. Without awareness, potential remains dormant. With awareness, it begins finding pathways into action. This is why self-observation is so powerful. Not because it makes us perfect, because it helps us identify what is helping growth and what is preventing it. Every belief either expands possibility or contracts it. Every interpretation either opens a door or closes one. Every assumption either supports exploration or reinforces limitation. The cumulative effect of these choices shapes the direction of a life. I have often wondered how many possibilities remain undiscovered simply because they were dismissed before they could be explored. How many talents remain undeveloped because someone concluded too early that they lacked ability. How many opportunities remain unseen because expectations narrowed perception. How many breakthroughs remain unrealized because an old belief convinced someone not to take the next step. These questions are impossible to answer fully. Yet they point towards something important. Human potential may be far less limited than we assume. The true limitation may often be the framework through which that potential is interpreted. This is why belief systems deserve careful attention. Not because beliefs are inherently problematic. Because beliefs act as filters. They determine what seems realistic. They determine what appears impossible. They influence what we attempt and what we avoid. The challenge is that filters are difficult to see while looking through them. A person wearing tinted glasses may eventually forget the glasses are there. The color appears normal. The distortion becomes invisible. Only when the glasses are removed does the difference become obvious. Awareness performs a similar function. It helps reveal the filters through which experience is being interpreted. Once revealed, those filters can be examined. An examination often leads to surprising discoveries. For example, many people carry beliefs about themselves that were formed years earlier under very different circumstances. A conclusion reached during a difficult period becomes a permanent identity. A temporary struggle becomes a lifelong definition. An isolated experience becomes a universal expectation. Over time, these conclusions begin shaping reality, not because they are objectively true, because they influence perception and behavior. The mind continually seeks evidence supporting what it already believes. This tendency is powerful, yet it is not absolute. Awareness can interrupt the process. Awareness can ask different questions. Awareness can seek new evidence. Awareness can remain open to possibilities that old assumptions would have rejected. This openness becomes increasingly important as consciousness matures, because maturity is not merely the accumulation of experience, It is the refinement of interpretation. Two people can live through similar experiences and emerge with very different levels of understanding. The difference often lies in reflection. One person repeats old patterns. The other learns from them. One reinforces existing assumptions. The other investigates them. One remains trapped inside familiar narratives. The other becomes curious about what exists beyond them. Curiosity continues appearing because it plays such a central role in growth. Curiosity keeps awareness flexible. It prevents certainty from becoming stagnation. It allows consciousness to remain responsive to new information. Without curiosity, belief systems become rigid. With curiosity, they remain adaptive. Adaptability may be one of the most important qualities for navigating an ever-changing world. Life rarely unfolds according to a fixed plan. Unexpected events occur. New challenges emerge. Circumstances evolve. A rigid mind struggles under these conditions. A flexible mind learns from them. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is openness. And openness becomes easier when identity is no longer tied to being right. The need to defend every belief begins fading. Learning becomes more important than certainty. Growth becomes more important than ego. Discovery becomes more important than control. These shifts create space for something deeper. A growing sense of alignment between awareness and action. Thoughts become more intentional. Choices become more conscious. Responses become less reactive. Life begins feeling less like a series of random events and more like an ongoing conversation between experience and understanding. This conversation never truly ends. Every stage of growth reveals new questions. Every insight opens the door to deeper exploration. Every expanded perspective reveals horizons that were previously invisible. And perhaps that is one of the most beautiful aspects of consciousness. No matter how much we learn, there is always more to discover. No matter how much awareness expands, there are always deeper levels of understanding waiting to emerge. The internal file folder is never completely finished. New experiences continually add new information. New insights continually reorganize old conclusions. The process remains alive, dynamic, evolving. And as we continue turning these pages, reviewing these assumptions, and questioning these inherited definitions of possibility, we begin approaching a realization so profound that it changes the way we understand not only belief systems, but the very nature of personal transformation itself.
Deep dive analysis, let's take a deeper look at one of the most important ideas explored in this discussion, the possibility that many of the limits we experience in life are not created by reality itself, but by the belief systems through which we interpret reality. At first, that statement may sound abstract, but when we bring it into everyday life, it becomes surprisingly practical. Think about a pair of prescription glasses. If the lenses are clear and accurate, they help us see the world more effectively. But if the prescription is outdated, the world begins to appear distorted. The problem is not the world itself. The problem is the lens. Beliefs work in much the same way. A belief is not simply an opinion. It is a filter that shapes how we interpret experiences, relationships, opportunities, and even ourselves. Most of the time, we are not consciously aware of these filters because we have been using them for so long. For example, imagine someone who experienced repeated criticism during childhood. Over time, they may develop the belief that they are never good enough. As an adult, that belief influences how they interpret feedback. A simple suggestion from a coworker might feel like a personal attack. A small mistake might feel like proof of inadequacy. Another person with a different belief system may interpret the exact same situation as an opportunity to learn and improve. The external event is identical. The internal interpretation is different. This is where modern neuroscience offers fascinating insights. Scientists have discovered that the brain is not a fixed structure. It continually changes through a process known as neuroplasticity. In simple terms, the brain strengthens the pathways that are used most often. Imagine walking through a grassy field. The first time you cross it, there is no clear path. But if you walk the same route every day, eventually a visible trail forms. The grass becomes flattened, and the path becomes easier to follow. The brain operates in a similar way. Repeated thoughts strengthen neural pathways. Repeated emotional reactions become familiar patterns. Repeated beliefs become automatic ways of interpreting reality. This is why certain reactions seem to happen without conscious effort. The brain has practiced them so often that they become the default route. The encouraging part is that new pathways can also be created. When we consciously choose different interpretations, different responses, and different perspectives, we begin building new neural roots. At first, these roots may feel unfamiliar. They may even feel unnatural. But with repetition, they become stronger. This helps explain why personal transformation is rarely instant. Many people become frustrated because they expect a single insight to change everything overnight. Yet the brain changes through consistent practice. Just as a muscle becomes stronger through repeated exercise, new mental and emotional patterns become stronger through repeated use. Another important concept involves the relationship between emotions and biology. Many people think emotions exist only in the mind. In reality, emotions influence the entire body. When we experience fear, stress hormones are released, heart rate changes, breathing patterns change, muscles become more tense, the body prepares for action. This response is extremely useful during genuine danger. However, the body often reacts to imagined threats in a similar way. If someone constantly anticipates failure, rejection, or conflict, the nervous system may remain in a prolonged state of stress. Over time, this can affect energy levels, focus, sleep quality, and overall well being. This does not mean positive thinking magically solves every problem. Rather, it means that our interpretation of events influences our biological state. A useful analogy is a smoke detector. A smoke detector is designed to alert us to danger. But imagine a detector so sensitive that it activates every time someone makes toast. Eventually, it creates unnecessary stress. Some belief systems operate in a similar way. They cause the mind and body to perceive threat where no immediate danger exists. One of the most valuable skills we can develop is learning to examine those internal alarms. The next question is practical. How do we actually do this? One powerful technique is self-observation. Several times throughout the day, pause and ask, what belief is influencing my reaction right now? If you feel anxious about speaking up in a meeting, explore the belief underneath the anxiety. If you feel discouraged after a setback, investigate the story you are telling yourself about the experience. The goal is not to judge yourself. The goal is to become aware. Awareness creates choice. Without awareness, patterns run automatically. With awareness, patterns can be changed. Another practical exercise involves keeping a simple journal. At the end of each day, write down one challenging moment and ask 3 questions. What happened? What did I believe about that situation? Is there another way to interpret it? This practice gradually reveals hidden assumptions that might otherwise remain invisible. Over time, many people discover that some of their strongest limitations are actually interpretations rather than facts. Perhaps the most important lesson is that growth does not require becoming someone different. Growth often involves becoming more fully yourself. The qualities you admire most, resilience, wisdom, creativity, compassion, courage, may already exist within you as potential. The process is not about manufacturing these qualities from nothing. It is about creating the conditions that allow them to emerge. Think of a seed. The seed already contains the blueprint for growth. It does not need to become something else. It simply needs the right environment. Human consciousness may work the same way. As awareness expands, outdated beliefs lose their influence. New possibilities become visible, different choices become available, and gradually what once seemed impossible begins to feel attainable. The deeper message here is not that life becomes easy. Challenges will always exist. Uncertainty will always exist. Change will always exist. The real transformation occurs when we stop viewing those experiences through outdated lenses and begin meeting them with greater awareness, flexibility, and understanding. Because the moment we recognize that beliefs are tools rather than prisons, we gain the freedom to update them. And in doing so, we may discover that our greatest limitations were never permanent realities, but simply old stories waiting to be rewritten.